Ladies and gentlemen, before I invite Mr. Mmusi Maimane, let me call upon Professor Dr. Sharudin Badarudin to give his welcoming speech.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. And good evening. The Honorable Mr. Mmusi Maimane, Opposition Leader, National Assembly of South Africa. Yang berhormat Datuk Seri Dr. Wan Azizah Wan Ismail, the Opposition Leader, Parliament of Malaysia. Yang berbahagia Datuk Dr. Mustafa Kamal Muhammad Yusof, Chairman of Akademik, Kepimpinan dan Pengurusan. Mr. Herbertus Warnwick, the Regional Director, Frederick Newman Foundation. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Institut Darul Ehsan or IDE, I would like to welcome the Opposition Leader of South Africa National Assembly, the Honorable Mr. Mmusi Maimane, to this dinner talk tonight. We would also like to express our sincere gratitude to Frederick Newman Foundation and also the Akademik Kepimpinan Pengurusan, AKP, for facilitating Mr. Maimane's presence here tonight. We are indeed honored to see so many of you here. Today we have a lot of the members of Parliament representing the People Justice Party and also the Party Amanah. And also we have most of our NGO leaders tonight. As I've said just now, we have members of Parliament, members of state legislative assemblies, leaders of political parties, the representative from NGOs, the Institution of Higher Learning, and also student leaders among the audience tonight. Let me also welcome Mr. Kat Sinthiamon, the Deputy Leader of Democratic Party Thailand. Ladies and gentlemen, just for a short introduction, IDE or Institut Darul Ehsan is actually an entity under the state government of Selangor. It is considered to be a research think tank to assist the state of government in formulating public policies and advocating good governance. IDE has also been entrusted with the role of promoting political literacy, especially among the youth. Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim, the de facto leaders of Parti Keadilan Rakyat or the People Justice Party, who is now considered to be a political prisoner, has been instrumental in pushing the establishment of this institute. With the support of the Chief Minister of Selangor, Yang Amat Berhormat Muhammad Azmin Ali, we started our operation actually in May 2015. Our core activities include academic research, surveys, seminars, publications, and trainings. This dinner talk tonight is a part of series of dialogue that we have organized for the last several months. More talks will be organized in the future featuring prominent figures from Malaysia and also abroad. In order to achieve its objective, IDE is also looking forward to collaborate with members of the civil societies, and we are trying to build our network with our think tanks locally and also abroad. We welcome participation from institutions and individuals who share our vision, missions, and valuable. And tonight, our talks will be, I think, so grateful because we have our young, newly opposition leader from South Africa, and the composition of South Africa and also Malaysia is quite similar in context of the politics and also in the context of ethnicity. And definitely when we talk about the struggle of the apartheid in South Africa, the struggle in South Africa is actually in our mind in Malaysia, because what you have in 1960s and also 1970s and 1980s is actually the struggle for ours. And especially our leaders such as Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim is actually fighting for that from the end of 1960s and the 1970s. And one of the person that he visited after he was released from jails is actually visiting Nelson Mandela. I think in 2004. Okay, so the struggle in South Africa is actually the same with the struggle of Malaysia. And once again, I would like to thanks for the attendance. We look forward to seeing you again in the future programs. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Shahrudin Badarudin. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Maimane is the first black South African to lead the DA, as well as its youngest leader to date, which won its highest votes ever in the last year's national election. This evening, Mr. Maimane is going to talk about political scenario in South Africa, especially from the opposition perspective, and sharing his experiences being such a young politician. I would like to sincerely thank Mr. Maimane for coming to speak before us this evening. Without further ado, let us put our hand together in welcoming the Honorable Mr. Mmusi Maimane.
Thank you so much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and it is my absolute great privilege to be with you here in this beautiful and this great country. I want to say, let me firstly thank the Ibrahim family and just say, as a young South African, having had the opportunity to celebrate leaders like President Nelson Mandela, leaders who understood that politics was always about a cause before it ever became about a career, that these were leaders who spent time in jail for their convictions, but didn't allow jail to shape their views of the world, and came out and fought, as President Barack Obama once said, didn't only just free the nation, but also freed the jailer. And so subsequent to that, we celebrate South Africans like that, but I draw deep inspiration from the Ibrahim family for certainly what you stand for, what your family has gone through, but ultimately for reminding us, a generation of leaders from across the board, that in fact we should dare never forget that the people and the cause are always ahead of any career. And so I want to thank you for your story and appreciate you being here tonight, and really my sincere gratitude. Let me also say, and Doctor, thank you so much for having us here. Thank you for the Institute for setting up such a great evening. When I got the brief, when I left home, they said, we'll just have a dinner with friends. And so, if in Malaysia you have so many friends, I would hate to have a formal function. But thank you so much, Doctor, and the Foundation for being here. To all the respective members of Parliament, I certainly had the opportunity to watch you from the gallery this afternoon. We landed this morning, so if I start to sound like I'm dizzy, just know that it probably is because jet lag will catch up with me. So I'll try and be brief today before I say embarrassing things. But in the main, as I watched the members of opposition, it reminded me so much of the struggle that we face at home. When you have a party that is in majority and is committed to pushing through laws that are not to the benefit of the people, but in the interest of just remaining in power. I watched so many of you fight the battle with such great passion that it made me miss a little bit of home. But I must be honest, our parliament has become, as I was watching it, I thought to myself, at least we're not the only circus. No, not that the parliament was, but we have had, we now have different parties who come in different outfits to parliament. But furthermore, we've also had police remove people and so forth and so forth. So it really is energetic as our parliament. And if any of you ever come to South Africa, please come and be entertained at our parliament at some point. But I also do think that I want to reflect a little bit about the story of Malaysia. It was a story that certainly, since I took over from the former leader of the DA, Helen Zille, on the 10th of May immediately I set it up. I said, one of the places I'm really wanting to go and go first would be to come to Malaysia. Because I think there's so much of a story that we share as South Africa and Malaysia, similar economic stories, perhaps a slightly different history, but with common themes. But more important, how do you move a nation from independence towards a prosperous nation becomes a question that is before all of us. And so I am here more so to learn from you than for me to anyways act in any position to teach. Certainly as a young South African, I would dare never to take that posture. But ultimately, want to appreciate the various meetings that we've had and the opportunities that we have to learn. So thank you very much. I also want to say that you really don't need to thank me for coming to Malaysia, because had people told me that Malaysia's got great food and great people, then really the privilege is all mine. So really my thanks is to you for such a beautiful place and great food. And I realized when I was sitting on the plane on Singapore Airlines and we were having one of the curries that they'd prepared for us, I thought to myself, if the food is that good on the plane, I can't wait to eat the food on the ground. And certainly you have not failed to deliver, as we say. But honorable members, ladies and gentlemen, South Africa faces an interesting time and an interesting days ahead. Because tonight is a dinner talk, I think in many ways I want to reflect. Personally, I want to tell you our story and perhaps maybe some lessons that we've learned from you and that we are learning all over the world. South Africa experienced a profound change in 1994. In 1994, South Africa freed itself from one liberation movement in many ways that had liberated the Afrikaners or the white South Africans from British colonial rule, and was replaced by another liberation movement. Growing up in the dusty streets of Soweto, we watched with great pride those moments. My political awakening began really in the late 80s, early 90s. One very significant event was watching on television the gunning down of a struggle hero. Someone I always thought was an incredible orator and a leader of the people, a man called Chris Hani. I remember watching that moment on television thinking to myself, here comes a country that would end up in great violence. I'd lived through the 80s in Soweto, so I know what it's like to make a petrol bomb. So I'm just telling you that in case you thought I was completely safe. Having marched with so many South Africans through the streets and watched violence, watched the use of police by a brutal regime that sought to oppress one on the basis of the color of their skins. I remember that moment because it stuck to my mind. I can tell you today, just like any traumatized child, what the color of the man's tracksuit was, for he'd just gone for a walk. Gunned down by a man called Janus Walus, and that set South Africa on a new journey. We had a decision to make whether we would have a peaceful transition or we'd have a violent transition. There are others who argue that it perhaps would have been better for South Africa to have undergone a violent transition, because in that way you can almost reset the button. But no, it required, subsequent to that, angry black South Africans, and so I was one of them. Many of us sitting in Soweto thought to ourselves, it'd be better for us to take up arms and continue the struggle, for what is the point of a peaceful transition? But I'll never forget, the second moment that impacted my political career was listening to President Nelson Mandela address South Africans from television. He stood, unlike ever before, no legitimate head of state had had an opportunity to address South Africans from the public broadcaster. Yet he stood there and he spoke to us as South Africans. He empathized with our anger. He reminded us that, yes, it would be easier for us to take up arms, but actually a peaceful transition would have been better. He called for all of us as South Africans to take up that moment and, if you like, trust the process of negotiations, trust the institution of democracy, and follow leaders who believe that peace ultimately would triumph over evil. In my life, I have watched many leaders, met many leaders. But that address is one that I will savor for the rest of my life, for that address set me on memory lane to say, it doesn't matter how evil the system becomes, peace should always triumph over evil. And so as it happened, we then took a number of years to negotiate our peaceful transition. Many things had to be negotiated, and many had to deal with the economic position of South Africa. And I think to understand South Africa today, you have to understand, perhaps in some ways, what would have been happening in the late 80s, early 90s. One is that South Africa was facing a rand crisis. Its currency was falling to levels that were unbelievable. Secondly, it had a few leaders that had to integrate a divided nation, a nation divided on the basis of race, which in many ways others would call the original sin of South Africa. It had challenges where land was distributed only to a few, while the many were put to economic spaces that certainly were not economically viable. The best economic opportunities were left to a particular race, the best businesses and the best opportunities. But it is therefore that when we agreed in 1994 that it would be better for us to vote out one government rather than to resort to any other manner, that I was too young to vote in 1994. It's one of the things that I look back on and I think, I wish I was born a little bit earlier. But I must be honest, I'm grateful I was born now. Because I think if a generation like Nelson Mandela were alive today, they would look at my generation and say, the struggle is indeed in your hands. Therefore, I don't regret one moment that I didn't vote in 1994. I'm most grateful that I have an opportunity to rewrite a new 1994 for South Africa. It is therefore that in 1995, South Africa signed into law its first constitution. The preamble therefore says we recognize that this constitution is the supreme rule of law, that we understand the injustices of our past, but that ultimately we commit ourselves to building a South Africa that is non-racial, non-sexist, prosperous nation for all. It required that kind of leadership that we could agree to that document. And in fact, this is where the story of the Democratic Alliance in fact intersects. Because one of the people President Nelson Mandela invited to sit alongside him at the signing of the Constitution was our former party leader, Helen Suzman. Helen Suzman was perhaps one of the few South Africans, white, Jewish South African, who stood in the opposition benches and fought against the apartheid government. Fought against it and said, look, I remember one of her most profound moments in Parliament, when the minister back then, the apartheid minister, stood up and said, Mrs. Suzman, your questions are designed to embarrass South Africa. And her response was, no, Mr. Prime Minister, it is not my questions that embarrass South Africa, it is your answers. And in fact, I draw inspiration from Helen Suzman, for here she was, a white South African committed to fight against a system that oppressed black South Africans. And I want to remind us why that's important in a moment. Because in signing the Constitution, it gave South Africans the right to be South Africans. It was, as Nelson Mandela put it, it's not that we are free, but have merely achieved the freedom to be free. And we began a journey chartered by so many to begin to make progress. We adopted an economic policy called the Reconstruction Development Program, or short RDP, that meant that for so many people they could get access to housing for the first time. But perhaps this was the challenge. When you have a leader like Nelson Mandela, you are filled with great hope, great optimism, and a belief that everything is possible. But not even someone as dignified, as incredible, as a semi-god as Nelson Mandela could perhaps maybe achieve all that 1994 promised. For he began a journey to non-racism whose journey is not complete. He began a journey towards freedom whose journey is not complete. He began a journey towards opportunities for all whose journey is not complete. I guess perhaps his initial job was to hand over the baton to a future generation of leaders. At my first opportunity to vote, I had an opportunity to vote, and I voted for the ANC. I was part of the ANC because I believed in the struggle that the ANC stood for. But we've got to reflect back and look at what perhaps subsequent to President Mandela, to President Mbeki, I want to look at perhaps maybe South Africa's recent past. Because there's been a progressive system designed to undermine that dream. And it's been begun by someone like, perhaps maybe in the second half of President Mbeki's tenure, and now accelerated under President Zuma. Because try as I like, it would seem that history does begin to repeat itself. Try as I like, it would seem that the very things the ANC fought against are the very things the ANC is suddenly becoming. And here perhaps are some of the challenges that we see. And you would appreciate it from where you sit, because perhaps maybe you've seen some of the challenges that I'm about to describe to you. South Africa today faces a country where unemployment is at staggering levels. People get shocked when I hear that Malaysia's unemployment level is at 7%. South Africa's is at 35%. 50% of South Africa's youth cannot find work. 70% of that are black youth who cannot find work. This is an army of young people available to anybody at any price. Hopeless. And so we have seen profound economic challenges. We have also seen that since 1994, those who were benefactors of the era before that have still remained benefactors subsequent to that. That in fact, race and wealth in South Africa still today are defined on the basis of the color of your skin. So it is indeed, if you are white, it's likely you are wealthy, and if you are black, it is likely you are poor. And it's within that context that we find that in fact the ANC has failed the most basic test, which I believe is the morality of any liberation movement. The morality of any liberation movement is that it has to govern and govern well. Because nothing betrays the struggle of our people than when the people have elected a leader or leaders who end up betraying them by being corrupt and stealing the people's money. And therefore, that's why when I went today to the province that we are in here today, the state that we are in here today, I met with the state minister, and I was grateful that he has spent his time in Selingno. I must get it right. Eh? Selangor. Sorry, it's the jet lag. If you are worried, just blame the jet lag. That in fact we have to govern and govern well. We have to ensure that those who are left outside economic opportunities must be brought into the system. We are also seeing more and more in South Africa the eroding of the constitution. We are seeing, not because the ANC does not have a 2/3 majority at this stage, but ultimately their greatest challenge is the fact that if they can't amend the constitution, they can undermine the constitution. In its starting point, those who wrote the Constitution in 1994 had President Nelson Mandela in mind. They did not foresee that a leader could rise up in South Africa with 700 charges of corruption, racketeering, and money laundering would rise to the office of president. That same leader today has profound powers. The president of South Africa has the capacity to elect judges, has the capacity to elect the National Director of Public Prosecutions, has the capacity to elect the National Director of Police. All right here? I'm glad we've got similar problems. And it's exactly on that basis that no president is going to elect somebody who's going to prosecute them. And certainly no president is going to elect the head of the crime intelligence who's going to prosecute his fellow comrades. So subsequent to all of that, it means the institutions of democracy fell apart. Furthermore, we have a corrupt president. I think that would be putting it mildly to say President Zuma is corrupt. He's built himself a palace for 200 million rands. But I hear you've got an MDB scandal here, so 200 million rands really is child's play in the levels of scandals. But we know it for a fact that we now have a president who's gone out of his way to set up a nuclear deal. Now, energy is a crucial challenge in South Africa. Now he's put together a nuclear deal that he stands to benefit well over $200 million from. But you ask yourself, why are the people not angry enough about this thing? You and I are angry, but it would seem that people seem to accept it. And you know, when I interrogate it even more amongst voters, they say to me, but Mr. Maimane, what you must understand is that it is better the devil we know than the devil we don't know. So yes, I guess this problem doesn't happen here. But in all fairness, we are also beginning to see the fact that in South Africa, the media has been bought off by the ruling party. So I hear that even here in Malaysia, news are censored for the benefit of the ruling elite. Television is no longer a public broadcaster, it's a state broadcaster. And there's a subtle difference between those things, but a profound difference. Because ultimately it means that what South Africans are watching at home is propaganda not too dissimilar to that of the apartheid government, that get told that they indeed have better lives than they had before. But the ultimate greatest challenge against the backdrop of unemployment is that we're seeing more and more South Africans become welfare dependent. Now, Malaysia has advanced the cause around minimum wage, and I listened to the numbers that you are quoting around minimum wage. Minimum wage as a legislation is still coming to South Africa. We've got sectorally determined minimum wage, but understand, our problem is unemployment at 35%. It does not matter. In fact, where you set the minimum wage, if you use a mean formula, it will have consequences of high levels of unemployment. And it could be used as a political field. Simply closer to an election, you must increase the level of minimum wage. I've just finished a court case where ultimately we took the government to court for changing the municipal boundaries, which I know this afternoon you are voting on a bill right here in Malaysia that speaks about how gerrymandering is taking place. So when I say that the struggle here in Malaysia and the struggle in South Africa are the same, I think we can find some commonalities. But the good news is this: tricks of dictators are not unique. They are true all over the world. Which begs the question, what then should we do? Because often people say to me that, but Mr. Maimane, now that you've painted to us that depressing picture, what then shall we do? Former President Bill Clinton once said, what's wrong with South Africa can be fixed with what's right with South Africa. And there are a few things that are right. The first is, South Africa still today has a vibrant private sector. And that's an important thing, because it means we can produce private media and private newspapers. So where we have an advantage is that every week I write a news. Not only do I produce a newsletter for the party, but I can write an opinion piece on a public platform that gets published without edits, without change, without anything, which is very helpful when you're seeking to communicate to people. We still have private radio stations, which means that when we issue a press statement, at least those private radio stations can get them. We have private banking, which means that my financial interests and those of the party remain protected. This is a luxury we dare never lose in South Africa. That there must be a vibrancy in the private sector, because if there isn't one, against levels of high unemployment, it means that if politicians don't feel that they can find work elsewhere, it gives them less of an incentive to move away from public office, because they recognize that that may very well be the only job they are able to get. And in Africa, this is not a unique challenge. Secondly, I believe what's right with South Africa is the party that I lead, if you don't mind me saying so, my own self. Because indeed, if the Democratic Alliance does not succeed in South Africa will not succeed. And here's how it is. Right now, South Africa is caught up in an arm wrestle between the populists on one side and the constitutionalists on the other side. The populists have gone around promising people more welfare, more social grants, more... Sorry? More? Sorry, I didn't get that. Oh, right, okay. So more of that, but they're also promising them unrealistic things. I listened to Julius Malema this afternoon on Hard Talk. Now, he's the leader of a party called the Economic Freedom Fighters, who in my view, and when you talk about my age and his age, it's quite coincidental that in South African politics, the number one party is the African National Congress, led by President Jacob Zuma, who is 72 now. Then the second largest party is the Democratic Alliance, led by me, who is half the president's age. The third biggest party is led by Julius Malema, who is exactly the same age as me. The fourth largest Democratic Party in South Africa is led by an honorable member called Mangosuthu Buthelezi, who is 80. So here is the question. Who will outlast who? I'm glad we've got age on our side. And they may have experience, but I suspect we will outlive them. So they can wear us down, but we certainly will fight on. But indeed, the reason I say what's right with South Africa can be fixed with what's wrong with South Africa can be fixed with what's right with South Africa, and that the DA is that, let me perhaps give you a context within which the DA started off. The DA started off in 1994. We only had 1.7% of the election. 10 seats in parliament. Our elections are every 5 years. And so we set ourselves the task that we could become the official opposition in South Africa, which means you only have to be the largest opposition party. Many people ask me the question, how did you become the Democratic Alliance? We merged back then with the National Party, so moving away from the DP to the DA, but then subsequently that merger did not work, so we sent off the National Party to the ANC. A history they will not tell you easily. But in 1999, we became the official opposition, winning 38 seats in Parliament. Furthermore, we began to grow. In the year 2000 and 2004, the DA increased and we went up to 50 seats in Parliament. In 2009, we grew to 16% of the vote, and in 2014, we grew to 22% of the vote. If an election was to be held today and now, our seat count is looking more and more higher. We've got more potential amongst black voters than any other opposition party. And I stand here confident that if we've shown growth in the past, we can continue that growth. And who knows, if we keep growing at the level that we are and hope that our opposition, which is the ANC, falls apart, we can prove the case that one day, and not that day far, if we fight hard enough, we could see a change in the South African Parliament, and hopefully we can have a DA-led government soon. So our growth speaks for itself. Along with the growth, we then began to govern in the city of Cape Town, which I know many of you think, no, in fact, that Malaysia is beautiful. And I will hand it to you, it is beautiful. But it's only second only to Cape Town.
I agree.
You can't compete with the mountain. And in truth, Cape Town is the most beautiful city in South Africa, was under an ANC government and was starting to decline. We took over the city of Cape Town, and now today, not only have we attracted the accolade of the best mayor in the world under Helen Zille, we have also been nominated now at COP17, literally this week. In fact, it might even be tonight, that the mayor of Cape Town is there receiving an award for being the best water system in the world by the city of Cape Town. Our argument is that we must prove the case that where we govern better. We didn't just stop there, we governed the state or the equivalent. Our equivalent is a province. We've got 9 provinces. Your equivalent is the state. We not only did win the state, but right now in the Western Cape, all the top awards for good governance were won by the Western Cape, at least last week. We're the only province that is producing clean audits, and ultimately we're the only province where unemployment is going down. These are important things in a world where race still plays an important factor. You cannot underscore enough that where you govern, you must demonstrate the fact that you govern better. Furthermore, we have shown the fact that we're the only party that still today fights for the constitution in South Africa. Fortunately, our constitution guarantees that the courts remain independent, the executive forms a part of government, and then Parliament is the apex of accountability. We have on any given day, and this is something that I often worry about saying in public, but we have not less than 16 court cases against the government at any given time. One of them is against the president for his spy tapes, which is, like we say, there were charges that were put against the president that were dropped for no reason. So we've had to take the president to court. But equally so, we also fight against irrational appointments and cadre deployment. The cause is not that we like going to court, but we want to strengthen that constitutional principle that says we must stand for ultimately the rule of law. Fourthly and nextly, is that ultimately we're the only party that must stand for non-racialism in South Africa. And this is how we want to fight with it, and this is perhaps maybe the point I want to make before you, is that often people believe that the best way to fight non-racism is to introduce a race dynamic to the issue. Yes, apartheid was a race-based law that outlawed so many. Under my predecessor, her job was to balance the fears of the minority with the aspirations of the majority. My job today is to say, we cannot be thinking in minorities and majorities. We cannot be thinking in black, white, Indian, or colored. We best be thinking first and foremost as South Africans. That the argument we must put forward to the people of South Africa, that the color of your skin must matter as far as the shape of your nose. That ultimately, the only race that must exist must be the human race. And therefore, to achieve that, we've had to write policies that say we want to build a non-racial future for South Africa. Yes, we must address historical injustices. And in many ways, that's about looking after the poor in South Africa, who in the majority are black. And yes, it's about introducing legislation that makes sure that the key benefactors of any redress policy are those who are poor. And ultimately, yes, we've supported legislation like broad-based black economic empowerment, primarily because we believe it must address historical injustices that deal with the poor. But like you, we know that race-based legislation ends up being captured for cronyism and the benefit of a few. Our fight is to make sure it is broadened so that it can accommodate the millions of poor South Africans. That is our fight. And in fact, when I go back home, I'll be tabling a document at our Federal Council that says, how do we deal with an issue of fairness and how do we build a fair society? South Africans still in the main, which is a problem unique to yours, face a fairly inferior education system. We have to ensure as an opposition that our work is about producing quality education for South Africans, that makes sure that the electorate, sadly for us, only half the children who start school in fact finish school, that by the time they reach grade 3, many of them are incapable of being able to write. My fight and my cause is to make sure that we can produce South Africans who can compete with anybody in the world, an education system that is powerful. The fight against that is about fighting against the unions who want to have teachers who serve the union rather than serve the kids who sit in their classrooms. Furthermore, we have to make sure South Africa is a safe place. As much as tourism globally is booming, our cause is that we make sure South Africa is safe so that anyone who wants to come to South Africa can have a safe country to come to. Our dream is that without fail, if you can achieve a country that is economically prosperous, that is non-racist, you can ultimately ensure that you address the historical injustices that we feel. Lastly, we have to make sure we protect the institutions of democracy. We have to make sure the judges that are appointed on merit. We have to ensure that those who serve as protectors of democracy are protected. That ultimately, institutions like the public broadcaster remain such. So, if we are going to pursue the dream, we ultimately have to be in government. And against the wave of populism, we believe that there's a fight that we are taking on. Next year is South Africa's local government elections. My key focus is to ensure that we get into government in 4 of the 8 big cities. That will be Cape Town, Nelson Mandela Bay, Pretoria, which is the capital, and the city of Johannesburg. We've set ourselves some key objectives. And those require activism, because people say to me, the future scenario of South Africa is where the opposition wins in the urban centers, but you lose in the rural centers. Our argument is this, is that when we prove the case by governing well in the urban centers, we are able to create a test case for the rural communities, for even poor South Africans can recognize where there's good governance. But we certainly don't stop there. We will be sending boots and activists on the ground. We've recruited now well over 20,000 activists to put in communities in South Africa that between now and next year will be visiting people. We are making, I went to visit our call center the other day. We've made well over 7 million phone calls to South Africans, committing them to the cause that we are committed to. We have to, without fail, make sure that we are conscious of dealing with key constituencies in South Africa so that people can understand that we are inviting them to our dream. We've called our dream Vision 2029. And if you visit our website, you can pick up what Vision 2029, it's a picture of South Africa's future under the DA. Because we believe whilst everybody is focused on the past in South Africa, we can be the party that speaks about the future. And the luxury of being young is that I can't authoritatively fight old battles, but I can authoritatively focus South Africa's energies towards a better tomorrow. So we want to win in Nelson Mandela Bay. And when we look at last year's polls, if an election was to be held today, the ANC would not win in Nelson Mandela Bay, they would not win in Joburg, they would not win in Tshwane, which means those metros are up for a game. The lesson that we've got to learn is how do we deal with coalitions, which I can appreciate have become part of the culture here. I always say, and I know someone might ask me later, will you go into a coalition with anyone? I want to say this to you, to use a football analogy. I try not to discuss a penalty shootout before the football match has begun. So allow us to play the game and aim to win before we can talk about penalties. We are also preparing ourselves for government, which requires us that we train an army of young people. So we run a young leaders program. We also run a parliamentary councillors, public reps development program. Next year, I'll be rolling out the first batch, and thanks to FNF, they're able to help us facilitate programs for young leaders, but they've also given us an opportunity where we can be able to train our public reps. Next year, I'll be training 200 in the first 6 months of the year and 200 in the second half of the year. Because we believe that the only way governments survive is if you've got the right people doing the right things in those governments. And so we attract between 15 to 20-year-olds to come into our training program, but we also attract our public reps to be able to function. And these programs will be coming out on board come next year. We hope that by the end of the 2019 election, we would have trained a significant army so that we can be able to capacitate not only what we do if we hopefully take over government, but also in the local municipalities that we intend on governing. We spend a significant amount of money, which I suppose is the last bit that is difficult. We have to raise our own money while the ANC depends on state-funded programs. So fortunately in South Africa, there's legislation that makes it possible for people to donate to opposition parties without having to declare it. It helps us. Yes, it's a difficult issue as to why, if you believe in transparency, don't you reveal your donors. But we know if we were to reveal our donors, they would face the same death threats and the same challenges that we do, and we would feel that that would undermine democracy. Therefore, we have to allow those donor bases to remain completely anonymous and confidential. My job as leader of the DA is in fact to spend 40% of my time raising money for the party. It's pretty much half my days are spent going all over the world raising money for elections. Because you can imagine, if the ANC gets a free advert on television, we have to purchase that advert. We have to purchase our billboards. We have to make sure our activists are on the road. But lastly, I want to applaud the fact that you, as Malays and various political parties, have shown the fact that you can do more with less. You've shown the fact that even though there's serious opposition, you can mobilize people to come on board. South Africa is a vast country, much bigger in land mass than many other countries. So sometimes to get people in January, I can't say the date because they're recording, but we're putting together a big march. But to do that, that requires us money because we have to transport people from various places and get them to the place. But we believe that whilst the ANC forgets that they are the party that maybe began a journey towards freedom, we're the party that will continue that journey. It's in the fact that freedom is never quite won. It must be fought for in every generation. Our job is to continue that journey now. That's why we adopted at our party's Congress 3 values of freedom, of fairness, and opportunity. We believe that we can advance the cause of freedom, which gives the right for South Africans to practice any faith, any religion that they want to. But we believe that we can build a fair society by addressing historical injustices, by producing a vision for tomorrow. But that ultimately we can open up opportunities for more, which the ANC has failed to do. So I want to commend you I want to thank you for all your hard work, but I also want to invite you to watch the space in South Africa where the next number of years are going to be the most exciting of the lot. Because think about it this way. If the DA is to win 4 out of the 8 metros next year, in 2016, in 2017, the ANC has to elect a new leader, which people don't know who it's going to be. Which means that party will be focused internally while we focus on ultimately 2019. Because who knows, whilst they are busy fighting amongst ourselves, we will fight for the future of South Africa. And I hope you can be a part of it. It is difficult, it is hard, but in the words of former President Nelson Mandela, it is always and indeed a long walk to freedom. So I hope you can be a part of that. Thank you very, very much.